hard. I mean, I can think of one in South Africa and one in Singapore. So you guys are in a very, very select, tiny little circle here. So it's really wonderful to be here. My wife Roseanne is here in the back. She'll be tending to all of the book orders. When we talk about tomorrow, we're going to talk about my book, Guardian Angel, which was her title, by the way. I wanted to call it The Perfect Enemy, and she said, no, you can't do that. So she has a much better title. So tomorrow when we talk about that, there's only a few copies here if you don't have one, but we can make sure that we get your name and address and stuff and get it to you. Tonight I thought I wouldn't start with the material on Guardian Angel. That's just the first 2 or 3 chapters of Genesis. Normally that takes about a full day and maybe some exercise stuff afterwards. We'll try to condense that a little bit. But tonight, because I didn't want people to come tonight or to miss tonight and then start in the middle tomorrow, I thought we'd look at something else. So we're going to look, unfortunately, we don't have the projection, but that's okay because we're only going to look at 2 verses. We're going to look at Jeremiah 29, 3 verses, 5, 6, and 7. So if you have a Bible, just turn to Jeremiah 29, 5, 6, and 7, and you have all the answers, except, of course, I have the pictures. So the title of this, I did this lecture one other time. It was in the basement of a house of the Billy Graham family. It was quite interesting. There's a long story behind how all that happened. And we were sitting around a big conference table and talking and stuff, and I said, well, we should talk about what it means to live the kind of life that you're called to in a place like we live in the United States or any place else in the Western world or in countries that think they're part of the Western world. So this is called Living It, The Hitchhiker's Guide to Babylon. Okay? Because whether you realize it or not, you're in Babylon. You live in a culture that deliberately disobeys the Word of God, that in many cases ignores God completely. In fact, Mircea Eliade wrote a wonderful book called The Sacred and the Profane, in which he argues that modern man is the first civilization in the history of human beings to desacralize the world. And what he means is, in all ancient cultures, the people of those cultures, even if they believed in false gods, believed in gods. They believed that gods filled the whole universe, and there were gods everywhere, right? Only modern man, since the Enlightenment, basically, has decided that God isn't anywhere, in the world at least, and ultimately modern man has now decided that God isn't anywhere at all, right? So you live in a world that has the sacred pulled out of it, and it makes a huge, huge difference to how you think about the world and how you interact with people who live in a culture where God is no longer relevant to their lives, right? That's it's interesting to me that the statistics on polling still suggest that 85 or 90% of Americans believe in God. But that means that 85 or 90% of the 85 or 90% might believe that there is a God, but he has absolutely no impact on their lives because they live as though they are part of a completely Western, secular culture, right? So what I thought would be really interesting is to look at what God says to his people when he's sending them into a completely desacralized, they believed in gods, but where he's sending them into an exile, a situation where they no longer, the culture around them doesn't believe in Yahweh, the God of Israel at all, and follows its own laws and rules and regulations and has its own religion, right? So it'll be really interesting to see what God says, because he's the one who's sending them there. And he has very specific instructions about what he wants them to do when he gets there, okay? So the first thing we'll do is look at the verse, and here's what it says. Now I have a New American Standard Version, but whatever version you have. Oh, okay, you got it up there, okay. This is verse 5. We're going to take one section of these words at a time, but we'll read through the whole thing once, okay? Build houses and live in them. Remember, this is God. He's sending the people into exile. By the way, they went into exile joyfully, right? They were like, oh, this is going to be a thrilling vacation. I can't wait to get to Babylon. Such a fabulous city. I mean, it's almost as good as Brooklyn. No? Okay. No, what did they do? I mean, first, the prophet Jeremiah comes to them, and what does he say? When the Babylonians are on the horizon, And he knows that there's going to be a siege in Jerusalem. What does the prophet tell the people of Israel to do? What does Jeremiah say to do? He says to surrender, right? And they're like looking at him like, you're from God and you're telling us to surrender? It's our God. He's on our side. How can we possibly lose, right? I mean, they're basically imitating Paul. If God is for us, who can be against us, right? So they're like, why should we surrender? We got God on our side. And what does Jeremiah say? No. God is the one who wants you to get captured and go into captivity. And if you don't surrender, you'll be killed. Well, they believed him, of course. No, of course they didn't. And so when they get hauled off into Babylon, the first thing that they are thinking of is, how come God failed us? Right? I mean, wouldn't you think that? You have this long history of this particular God on your side, from the Exodus, by the way, right? And now this God is sending you into exile. What are you thinking? How come God failed us? What did we do that he was so mad at us that he destroyed our civilization, right? That we're all carried off. And besides, it already happened once, but we've removed ourselves from those, the other relatives. We've removed ourselves from them so that we're pure, and God does it to us too. I mean, what's going on here, right? So now God marches them off, right? That's what Jeremiah says. Look, the bodies will be stacked up like cordwood. It's going to be a real mess. So God marches them off. He doesn't take them all, though. This is important. Who do they take into Babylon? They take everybody? They go through the villages, do a census, take everyone? They take, well, if you're Nebuchadnezzar, who would you take? Yeah, first you take any male who might become later an insurgent, right? A rebel, a fighter. So you make sure you get rid of them. If you don't kill them, this is standard practice in the ancient world. When you go in, it's mafia 3500 BC, right? You make sure that the son, the grandson, the great-grandson, the uncle, all of them are dead, because otherwise they're going to raise up something against you later, right? So in this case, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't kill them all. He exports all the ones who might potentially be threats later. So he takes the aristocracy, the royalty, the intelligentsia, the strong warriors, right? We have examples of that. Daniel, the book of Daniel, right? Tell us about who he takes. Who does he leave behind? Yeah, I mean, I can tell you who he leaves behind. We drove down here from Claremont, and we went on the back road 33 down, right? We went by all those little tiny houses, trailer homes and stuff that are out in the woods. No invading army cares about them. No, it's fine. Let them go. We don't care. We want the mayor, the deputy mayor, the sheriff, right? We want the police. Those are the guys we're after, the people with the guns, right? We want to export them, okay? So, of course there are people left behind. Now, why is that important? Because the people left behind are still there when the exiled ones come back, right? So this is an important question because it has something to do with the language that's spoken in Israel when Yeshua walks the earth, right? The standard seminary answer is, well, it's Aramaic because they learned Aramaic in Babylon and the exiles came back. But wait a minute. Most of the people were still there. Because you don't take all the farmers and all of the people who are scattered all over in the little villages, you don't take them. Do you think that they learned Aramaic while they were still in Israel speaking Hebrew? No, of course not. So what happens is Aramaic is imported into the culture, but Hebrew is already spoken there. So now in the time of Yeshua, you have Aramaic, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, all in the same culture. Latin, of course, from the official Roman stuff, and Greek because it was the lingua franca of the economic world of the Mediterranean, right? So when people start somebody will come to you and they'll say, that passage that Matthew quotes from Isaiah, he doesn't quote it correctly because if you go look at the Hebrew text, Matthew changed the verb and he moved this pronoun over here and he changed that adjective and the standard answer will be, yeah, but Matthew used the Septuagint, Greek, right? Okay? And your response should be, no. That's not what's happening here. Matthew is translating the passage for his own purposes and modifying it according to his cultural understanding at the time because he doesn't have to be in Aramaic or in Jewish Greek in the Septuagint for him to use it, right? There's no evidence For even the ostracons, the stuff that you find in coffins, right, and where you put ashes and stuff. Even the ostracons, most of them are in Hebrew, not in Aramaic. And we know that Yeshua taught in Hebrew because all the rabbis taught in Hebrew, right? You learn the scripture in Hebrew. So even though Aramaic was in the culture and it came from Babylon, the identity of the people was still Hebrew, right? That mix comes together and makes a big difference, because now you can say those words that Yeshua spoke in the Gospels, he probably spoke in Hebrew. In fact, the only places where it says, where the narrator, like in Mark, for example, when he heals Jairus' daughter, right? Okay, he speaks in Aramaic. But guess what? The narrator of the passage, the guy who wrote the passage down, he said, he gives the Aramaic, and then he says, which means, and then he translates it for you. But if you were an Aramaic speaker, you wouldn't need it translated, would you? Right? You only need it translated because you don't read Aramaic, right? Okay, so the whole idea is that issue begins here, where God sends these people into exile, because in Babylon they don't speak Hebrew. So the Jews are going to have to learn a new language to get along in Babylon, right? So God sends them off, and the result, linguistically, is this multiple language stuff that shows up 800 years later or 700 years later, okay? So just an interesting little linguistic aside. Now let's go look and see what God says. Build houses and live in them. Also plant gardens and eat their fruit. Next verse. Okay? Take wives and have sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, so that they may bear sons and daughters and multiply there and do not decrease. Next verse. Okay? Also seek the shalom of the city. That's interesting. The word was already put into Hebrew, right? Instead of in the NASB it says seek the peace of the city. Okay? Where I took you as captives in exile, and prayed to Adonai for it. For in its shalom you will have shalom. Okay? Got it? Simple, right? Okay, now let's back up and see what this all means. And the first thing that you have to do is remember that you are an oppressed people in exile. You have been forced out of your homes, your culture has been destroyed, and the masters, the oppressors, are carrying you off to Babylon. So, what's the first thing that you're going to do when you get there? What? Well, nope. You wouldn't have to learn the language if you're all in a group. You just keep speaking your own language, and you isolate yourself from those bad guys who are the oppressors who destroyed my house back in Jerusalem. Okay? And what else do I do? I'm sorry? Yes. And how do you do that if you're a slave? You run around, you create a big refugee camp, and everybody goes and scours through the garbage dumps to get what they can, huh? Is that what would happen? Okay? What's your attitude toward the oppressors? You welcome them with open arms. You say, I'm so glad to be in Babylon. I was looking forward to this. No? Right? No. You start a rebellion. That's exactly right. And that's exactly what the Babylonians expect. They expect resistance, hostility, an attitude of defiance. They expect people to isolate themselves, to keep apart as much as they can. They expect that they're going to have a really tough time with these slaves because we've just walked through their entire world and destroyed it, right? What does God say? The first thing he wants them to do? Build houses. Wait a minute. Of course, you arrived in Babylon with 2 truckloads of lumber, sheetrock, tile, cement, right? No. How are you going to build a house? Do you have anything when you get there? No. How many of you seen Fiddler on the Roof? Okay, how much did they take with them when they left? Whatever they could put into a wheelbarrow or a cart, right? In other words, and that's a lot, by the way, but the same idea occurs here, doesn't it? God sends them out into exile in a country where they have no connection to anyone, no favors to ask, nothing. They have a master, and they have a master-slave relationship. And the first thing he does is tell them to build houses. How? How are you going to do that? Right? You can't build a house from matchsticks. You're going to have to build a house from materials that you get someplace. Where are you going to get the materials? It has to be from the master, right? So you arrive, and the next day you come in chains or whatever, right? You're in a big refugee camp, and you go up to the master and you say, you know, God, my God's instructed me to build a house. Could you please provide me with concrete, you know, sheetrock, nails? Right? What's he going to say? Forget it. Right? In other words, behind the commandment to build is the expectation that you will have a relationship with the master so he will provide the resources. You can't build a house if the master doesn't allow it, right? So what does that mean? You will have to have an attitude toward the master that encourages him to want you to live there. You will have to cooperate. In other words, you'll have to become the kind of slave that he's willing to say, here's the material for your house, please build one, okay? In other words, the first thing that God does is shatter your expectation that you're going to create a fifth column in Babylon and overthrow the people and get back to your own home, okay? Plus, build houses is not quite the same as live in a refugee camp, keep your tent ready to be packed up, right? What does build houses mean? Permanence. You're going to be there for a while, right? My goodness, I don't want to be here for a while. The only thing I'm thinking about is how to get out of here. I want to get back home, right? And the first thing God tells me is, no, that's not in the plan. You have to have the right kind of attitude, the right kind of relationship. You'll need resources because I want you to build houses. Okay? Got it? All of a sudden, you have to start changing your mentality about what it means to be an oppressed people in a foreign culture. You have to start thinking in terms of cooperation, not in terms of hostility, aggression, or isolation. It won't work. You can't build a house if you maintain those attitudes. You'll have to learn how to cooperate. Okay? You have to learn how to get along. Okay? And by the way, he doesn't say just build houses. I want you in the construction industry. Let's get a big development going in Babylon Gardens, and we'll have a security guard and stuff. No, what does he say? It's not about building houses. It's about building houses to do what? To live in them. Okay? Now the interesting thing about but that's because the word that they use here is yashav, and it does not mean to be a sojourner. It means to sit and dwell, right? In other words, God could have sent them off into Babylon and said, in a couple of years, this is what they're thinking, by the way. In a couple of years, our God will come back and he'll rescue us. What does God say? I want you to build permanent structures and get used to sitting in them. Okay? You're going to be there for a while. Right. So in order to make that happen, look, I can build a house. I can take you to Jakarta and show you how to build a house in less than a day, right? You gather wood from the garbage piles, you get a piece of tin, you lay it on top of some 2x4s, you put a blanket over it, you got a house. But it's not a permanent house, is it? It's completely temporary because you're not going to be there very long. That's very different than build houses where you're going to live for a long time, because now you have to care about what goes in the house, right? Now you're thinking, oh my goodness, if I'm going to be here for a while, I better make sure that I've got the plumbing right and I've got the electricity coming in right. I can't just hang wires from the ceiling. I'm going to have to, do some really construction work here. I'm going to have a good foundation. No sense in building on top of this riverbank, right? You see what I'm saying? It changes your attitude about where you are and why you're there. And all of a sudden you have to start living in the community. Right? You have to become part of it because what you're building is going to have to last. I was in, I can't remember now. I think it's called Rocky Point. It's a place in Mexico, just south of Arizona. Rocky Point is much like the Mexican resorts all over the coast. There's big, huge hotels on the beach. And then there's a community where the Mexican workers live. They don't live in big hotels, right? The government actually might provide something for them, but generally they live in very poor conditions because they service the big hotels. And outside of Rocky Point is a place just like that. It's right next to the sewer plant and the garbage dump. And I know a guy in Arizona who started a charity to build houses there, right? Because these people were living in hovels, okay? So he started, his idea was, we're not going to go down there and just build you a house, because if we build a house for you, it's not your house. If you don't have sweat equity in it, it won't belong to you, and you won't take care of it. And his insight was perfect, because you can go through the barrio there, and you'll see the houses that were actually built by the people who live there. They actually have a little garden in front. The houses are painted. The street in front of the house is clean, right? And then you go to the next block where a charity organization went in and built a house for someone. There's graffiti all over it. The windows are broken because they didn't care. Somebody else gave it to them, okay? So this guy started this idea that the only way you can get a house built is if you help build your neighbor's house first. You earn building credits. And you might have to build 2 or 3 houses for someone else, with the neighbor involved, by the way. As a community, you would build a house for one person, and then you earn credit towards somebody coming and building your house. And he's transformed that garbage dump barrio into a real city, right? Because, why? Because it was involvement of the people who were there changing how they lived in that community. And I think that's what God's doing. He's saying, you're going to go into this community. By the way, this community is hostile to you. This community believes that they did the right thing by oppressing you because they're bringing civilization to your world, right? It's the Roman idea, the civilization of the world, right? And, by the way, you were defeated, and you come with nothing, and you're a slave. And now what God is saying is, get involved. Get involved. Don't be isolationist. Don't have the attitude of defiance. Get involved. That's the only way you're going to be able to do this. Build and live. Okay? All right? Build houses and live in them. Also, plant gardens. Okay? Great. How are you going to do that? What do you need to plant a garden? Seed, land, tools, right? Water, all the kind. I mean, you can throw seeds on the ground, but you're not going to get a garden, right? And you got to get seeds. So guess what? Now he went to the master and said, I've been working for you so hard and so long. Couldn't I just have a little bit of lumber to build a house? And he says, sure, yeah, you've been really good. In the last couple of years, you've done a fabulous job. I'd love for you to have a house close by so you can work harder, right? Okay? No, none of this 30-minute commute to work, right? Okay? And then you come to him a few months later after you've been building, you say, you know, my God, he's really asked me to plant a garden. Now what are you asking from the master? You're asking for land. You're asking for seed. You're asking for the ability to grow your own food, which makes you fairly a little bit independent. So the only way the master is going to let that happen is if he believes that you're trustworthy enough that you're not going to run off, right? And he's going to grant you some land. Now, it's not yours to keep. It's yours to plant, okay? So that's okay, because you can make a deal with the master. Okay, I'm going to give you some of the fruit and by the way, master, I'm not going to do this on your time. I'm going to do it on my time. I'll get it all done so it doesn't interfere with my relationship with you, right? But I'm going to get involved in providing for myself. There's only one problem. It's called Torah, right? It specifies how long you have to wait before you can eat the fruit of a tree. How long? 3 years. He doesn't say plant gardens. He says plant and eat their fruit. And the reason that he says that is because you now have to wait 3 years to fulfill this commandment. Okay? So if God came to you today and he said, you live in Babylon, get involved, build houses, settle down, plant a garden and eat the fruit. You know you're going to be there for at least 3 years, right? End of story, no argument, 3 years. By the way, if God came along and told you that today, you could stop reading all the eschatology books, because you know you'd have at least a 3-year waiting period, right? Okay? So here's the deal, God, and by the way, for the same thing happens in Babylon, right? They know, hey, we're not getting out of here for at least 3 years from the time that they plant the garden. But they didn't plant the garden on day one, did they? They also had to earn the right to plant the garden and to have the master grant them some land, and et cetera, et cetera. So this is already a long period. And now God says, settle in, plant your garden. In 3 years' time, you'll be able to get the fruit from it. Okay? right? I mean, you can get pineapple in a year, but you can't get fruit trees in a year, okay? So you see what's happening? God is settling these people into a long process that leads towards self-sufficiency, because now they're actually growing their own food, but it can only happen in cooperation with the world that they live in. No one is going to give them seed or land if they believe that these people are not trustworthy and that they will rebel and cause them grief. It just isn't going to happen, right? Okay? So God has some really interesting things in this commandment that tells you his perspective on what these people are going to do in Babylon is long term. All right? Notice what it says. Also plant gardens. Who in Scripture planted gardens? That's supposed to remind you of something. Well, who's the first garden creator? Adam didn't plant the garden, dear. All Adam did was tend it. God planted the garden. Wait a minute. If I'm reading this verse and I'm Torah observant, I will remember, my goodness, this is what God did. And what garden was that? The Garden of Eden. Gee, that sounds just like Babylon, doesn't it? I mean, maybe what's happening is God is saying, you know what? We're in the process of turning Babylon into the Garden of Eden. Let's get busy here and restore what I had in mind for Babylon. And I'm going to remind you about that by telling you to start by planting a garden, which would remind you of the story of Genesis so that you'll know that this is what God intended, that the Garden of Eden would expand around the whole world, and now you're part of it. You're going to make Eden where you are. Right? This is not about, I'm going to get you out of here and back to the garden as fast as you can. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, back to the garden. It's not going to happen, right? What's going to happen is you're going to make the garden where you are, right? Think about that. You live in exile. You live in Babylon. What are you doing to make the garden happen where you are? Because that's what God's telling them to do. Make the garden happen here. Okay? Got it? And if you're successful in making the garden happen here, it will provide for you. You will eat of the fruit of that garden. Okay? It isn't going to happen overnight, but God is telling you, get back to Genesis and think about the purpose that I had at the beginning and start acting that way. Okay? Now let's see what else he says. Go back. We're not done with this verse yet. Eat their fruit, okay? So remember, garden is supposed to remind you of Genesis, the story where God plants the garden. But I'm sorry? Yes. Eat their fruit also reminds you of a story, doesn't it? Yeah. It should remind you of the story of Adam. We started with God planting the garden, and now we're going to talk about eating fruit, which should remind you of the story of Adam, okay? So you know what the command is when God gives Adam one dietary command. That's it, just one. What does he say? He says, of all of the trees of the garden, you may, we translate it, freely eat. Okay, it's akatokel. You may eat. You may stuff yourself. Okay, of all the trees of the garden, you can stuff yourself, except this one tree. This tree you're not supposed to eat from. Okay, so what we have here is a second reminder of the Genesis story so that you will realize that you can't just go liberally out there and do whatever you want. It's still bounded by God's instructions and his purposes. Otherwise, you'll end up just like Adam, planting a big garden and reaping the fruit to put in bigger barns. And that's not what God has in mind, right? He has something else in mind. He has the idea that you will plant a garden like he planted a garden, and you will eat from it in the way that Adam was supposed to eat from it, right? Because it's the same. Look, you know how Hebrew works? Hebrew is a massive connect the dots book, right? So you run across this verb akal in one verse, and you find it 600 years later or 700 pages later in another verse, and you say, connect the dots, right? I connect the dots with all the words and phrases that are the same. So I have a massive connect the dot book. And here's an example of a connect the dots. God's not saying plant gardens and eat of it just because It seemed like the next thing to do. He's reminding you of the stories that already occurred with gardens and eating fruit so that you'll remember who you are and who he is. Right? You got to remember that because now you're in exile. You just got kicked out of the garden, and now he's telling you, move the garden where you are. Okay? All right. One more. What is the connection between this verse and Genesis 41:52? Somebody's going to have to look at that verse, though, aren't you? Genesis 41:52. We're doing connect the dots. It's an interesting story because it's going to connect us to a very important character who has a lot to do with the Babylonian Exodus, or Babylonian exile. Genesis 41:52. What does it say? Oh, you got it up here. And the second he named Ephraim because, what? God has made me fruitful in the land of my oppression. Oh, isn't that where I am? Holy mackerel. This Joseph story is also hidden in the connect the dots, isn't it? Because if you know that God has made me fruitful in the land of my oppression, you know Ephraim is the name of the son of Joseph because Joseph experienced exactly the same thing. And all of a sudden I realize God's connecting me with his garden, with Adam's commandment, and with Joseph's response. And now I have some history behind this. Oh, you thought God just marched in and gave you another set of instructions, right? Nope. God is playing history on you. He's letting you feel what has happened over the thousands of years that Israel was supposed to be doing what God intended and how they lost their way all along. And now he's giving you another way to look at that. And he's saying, oh my goodness, don't you see what you're experiencing is Genesis and Joseph. We're right back at the beginning and you're walking through these things again, right? This is a start over story. Okay? Got it? Good. Mary, next verse. Back to Jeremiah. Okay? Take wives. Okay? In NASB it says marry, which is not right. It should say take wives. Take wives and have sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons and give them to your daughter. Give your daughters to husbands, so that they may bear sons and daughters and multiply there and do not decrease. A lot of stuff in this verse. Okay? So let's just start the first one. Take wives. Take wives uses a very common expression in Hebrew for seizing, taking. Okay? It doesn't say marry. It says take. Okay? But here's the important thing. It is the absolutely most common expression for take. It's used over 1,000 times in the Tanakh. Okay? So that means God is not expecting you to have a special taking. He's telling you, do the ordinary thing when people get together. People decide to get married. And by the way, when they decided to get married in the ancient world, it was just the perfect Romeo and Juliet story, right? I mean, it's the lovers, the two of them, they run off, elope, it was wonderful. No, what happens in marriage contracts in the ancient world? Who's involved in a marriage? Yeah, but more than the parents. The marriages are arranged usually for political or economic reasons. It's okay if you fall in love afterwards, that's fine. But the idea is it's a family contract. Everyone in one family decides that a union with another family makes good sense for the family, right? So you're talking about contractual relationships, right? Now, why is that important? Because God uses the common verb for take, which means that he's not saying, as far as I'm concerned, have contractual relationships with only the people in your group. You see, he doesn't specify where the wives are coming from, does he? He says, take wives. And by the way, there are a lot of very good-looking Babylonian women who have really interesting families. Okay? Now, what does that mean? That means that you have to involve yourself with the Babylonians so that their family and my family start to agree on what matters for families. You see that? What? No, there's a difference. You're right. The danger in all of this is to assimilate. Okay? So you have a very, very good example of a very important person who assimilated.
But that changes the slave master.
Wait. Just hold on to that. That's right. But I want to get this one. Okay. Tell me the paradigm example of a man who assimilated as a result of marriage. Solomon. Solomon assimilated, right? Started off really great. And then, by the way, there's a little contract with the daughter from Pharaoh, and another one over here, and one more over here, and another one over here, and pretty soon it's like, and he fills up his harem. He assimilates, okay? God doesn't have that in mind. He says, take wives and marry them, and by the way, have children and grandchildren, and give your sons to other families, and give your daughters to other families, and make all this family arrangement happen. But he never says, assimilate. He says, you're going to live in such a way so that those people who are the outsiders will come to you and say, hey, this makes really good sense for us. You're hard workers. You have a great attitude. You take whatever resources you have and do something with them. You've learned to provide for yourself. Those are the kind of values we want for our children. Maybe we should get together, right? Do you see what's happening? Now, we take, unfortunately, especially if you come out of the evangelical world, we take the idea that you must be separate. No unequally yoked stuff going on, right? That the people that you marry must have exactly the same belief structure that you have, or it will be outside of the will of God. But what's he saying here? Get busy, right? Start making friends of all these people that are around you. By the way, nobody's going to marry an enemy. So let's get going on creating relationships between families, because that's what's happening now. It's not Romeo from the Sicilians who's going to run off and marry Juliet from some Polish family. That isn't going to happen. What's going to happen is the two families will first get together, and then they will say, oh, I have a son, you have a daughter. Wow, maybe this will really work, right? In other words, what's behind this command is the idea of families interacting with families. Now, does that happen within the community? Of course it happens within the community. But it doesn't happen within the community only, or God, I believe, wouldn't have used the very common word for taking wives. There's something else that happens in this story, though. And for that, you need to know that there's a warning. There's a warning built into this story. And that warning comes from the last few chapters of the book of Judges. So tell me how taking wives has a warning built into it. What do you know about the last few chapters of Judges? Well, first tell me about the book of Judges. Look, every Bible story is a story about another story. Okay? So we might be reading about going into the exile, but we're already reading about the story of Genesis and the story of Joseph, aren't we? They're already built into the story. So do you think God doesn't have a story built into this one? Of course he does. There's another story built into this verse. Tell me about the book of Judges. What's the book of Judges about? Judges, of course. That was easy, wasn't it? The word judges should probably be translated chieftains, because it's about the heads of the tribes. Okay? What happens in the book of Judges? Tell me about, just in one sentence or less, tell me what happens from the beginning of Judges to the end of Judges. What happens to Israel as a whole? It's a massive social decline. They go from worse to worser to worsest, right? They go right downhill. And God keeps calling back another person to rescue them, and a few years later they collapse some more until you get to the end of the book. At the end of the book, there's a very interesting story. The end of the book is after the Israelites themselves attack another group of Israelites and slaughter them all, except 300 men or something who escape, right? They're from the tribe of Benjamin. And then they realize, my goodness, we've just killed off all possibilities for the name of Benjamin to survive, because we killed all the women and all the children, and those 300 men escaped, and they have no wives, right? In other words, their own rage and their own expression of violence toward their own kinsmen has now caused them to be in a place where the tribe of Benjamin will disappear forever, right? And What's really ridiculous is you would say, well, yeah, but why don't they just marry somebody from the tribe of Judah? Because the chieftains took a vow when they didn't like what Benjamin was doing, when Benjamin's tribe didn't come to their aid, to never let anyone else from any of these tribes marry anybody from Benjamin. So they made a vow that prevents them from actually fulfilling what's needed. So what do? They steal women from another area, right? Take wives. God's saying, okay, I want you to be involved. But remember, there's a warning behind this. Remember what happened in Judges. You are not going to go out and steal wives. In order for you to fulfill this command, you will have to do it by family integration, not by aggression. Because where did that leave them? You know where it leaves them? It leaves them with the monarchy. The reason Saul shows up is because the people have experienced such horrible social chaos that they call out to God and say, we have to have a king. We can't live with this disorder anymore. In other words, at the end of Judges, Israel's basically at civil war. Right? So, God says, take wives, but that reminds you of the warning of what happened in Judges. So you know you just can't go out and grab anybody you want. It's going to happen through mutual agreement. And that means you got to get along with the people next door. Okay? Take wives. And by the way, give your daughters to husbands. Okay? So this is both sides of the equation going on. Okay? And then he says, so that they may bear sons and daughters. By the way, you don't get married to do nothing, but just enjoy marital bliss. God always has a purpose in mind. And what's the purpose? To have another generation. Wait a minute, I had to wait 3 years for the fruit tree. Now I gotta wait until my 11-year-old gets old enough to marry somebody in another family and then wait for them to have children? Oh, it's worse than that. And that they may have children. Now I'm stuck for at least a generation. I mean, you're kidding me. The fruit tree will be grown up and withered by the time I get through this promise, right? So now all of a sudden I'm realizing that God has not got just a little bit of time in mind. He has at least 2 generations in mind, okay? And if I start today, it's going to take me a long time to get to the point where I find the proper wife or husband, get the family marriage contract in place, wait for the children, and then wait for the grandchildren. Right? Now I better have a permanent house. That's going to be there a while, right? I'm going to be there a long while. All right. Oh, and then there's this really interesting command. He says, have children. By the word is yalad, which is to beget, to bear, bring forth. Have a yalad, have yaled, child, right? Interesting thing about that. Because what's involved in this whole commandment about giving your sons and daughters and having grandchildren is another word that's derived from the same verb. It's toledot. Do you know what that word is? Generations, right. So what God is saying is, remember, there's a hidden warning in take, right? There's also a hidden blessing in this description, because in the blessing is toledot. What's toledot all about? Generations. Why is God concerned with generations? And you keep tradition and you keep God in the forefront of everything, but there's something else that goes on here. Very, very, very important in Jewish thinking. No, not culture. That's close though. You maintain the name, right? Toledot is about names. And these are the generations of. And then they start naming all the people, right? Why? Because the name must continue, right? In other words, if I'm going to find wives for my sons and husbands for my daughters, I'm doing that because I want the name to continue. My name, which is part of Israel from time immemorial, has to continue, okay? That should remind you of another story. God, isn't this interesting how all these little tiny words connect to other stories? So let's try another story. Where is there another story that is about maintaining the name but involves somebody from the outside? Ruth, right? What's the whole argument in the book of Ruth? How are we going to maintain the name of Elimelech? Right? But in fact, at the end of the story, His name is gone anyway, because now it becomes the name of Ruth and Boaz that goes on, right? And by the way, Ruth and Boaz are in the genealogy of who? The Messiah. Oh my gosh, in this one little tiny verse, God just connected me to the outsider, Ruth, who's a Moabite, right? The insider, the Toledot of their own generations. Where does Ruth come from? What's her Toledot? She comes from Moab, right? But worse than that, where does Moab come from? Lot's incest with his daughters, right? Boom, big scandal starts the whole thing. What about Boaz? Where does he come from? Back further. Judah and Tamar. Oh my gosh, we have scandals inside and outside. And the two scandalous people come together and create the line of the Messiah. Isn't that amazing? Right? So what is God telling you in this inside story? Hey, you think that you're out here being punished. I have you out here to create new lines. By the way, we're going to bring the outsiders inside to create the line. Right? It's the story of Ruth all over again in one or two words. All right? Let's try the end of this, okay? That you may multiply, but not decrease. Now, wait a minute. This is a completely redundant commandment. Because the whole thing is take wives, have sons, have daughters, have grandchildren, have great-grandchildren, be around for a long time, make lots of people. And then God says, multiply but not decrease. Why would he say that? He's already said it. Why would he say it again? Yeah, but that's what he says, to keep our sons and daughters, and they're going to have grandchildren. And why does he want to have that there? Because you see, in Hebrew, it has a little different flavor. It says in Hebrew, urebu sham. It's not multiply. It's multiply there. Sham, right? In that place. Okay? So you could say to yourself, wow, God, he's opened the door for us to have these family marital contract relationships going, and we're going to become an army. We're going to become this big army, and then we'll take over. What does God say? No. You're going to multiply there, in that place. I want you to have sons, grandsons, great-grandsons, and by the way, you're going to be here for a while, so multiply right where you are, okay? That should remind you of another story. Where does God have his people where they stay where they are and they multiply? Ta-da! I mean, do you see the connections now? We started with garden. We end up with Adam. Then we go to Joseph. Now we're back to Judges. Then we go to Ruth. Now we're back to the Exodus. My goodness, God's giving you the whole history of Israel in a few verses that have to do with Babylon. Isn't it amazing? Yeah. So what does he say? Multiply there. And in fact, the word means to become numerous, like locusts. And that should remind you of another story. Okay? So, not just a family affair. Now it's a whole nation in exile. And all these reminders are to, look, you're the people. Are you getting these reminders spread over 25 years of existence in Babylon? No. Jeremiah is delivering this message before you even get there. And he's saying, do you think God forgot about you? Did he forget about you in Egypt? Did he forget about Adam and Eve in the garden? Did he forget about Joseph? Has God left you behind? Did he forget about Ruth and Boaz? No. He's saying, here I am. I'm Jeremiah the prophet bringing you the word of God, and I want you to know you're going into the exile, but it's okay because God's with you. And he has all these things in mind for you. And he's promising all this fulfillment in all these stories that you already know about what he did. So don't be afraid. Go to the place that he sends you and do what he wants you to do. And you will become what you were supposed to be that sent you into exile in the first place. Okay? So now he says multiply. But then why does he say do not decrease? If he tells you to multiply, why would he bother to add do not decrease? I'm sorry? Yeah, but if I'm multiplying, why do I have to also be told not to decrease? Ta-da! Exactly, because it's about assimilation. You see, I can multiply like crazy and assimilate into the culture, and the name will be lost, and God's purposes won't be fulfilled. The reason that it says do not decrease is because God is saying you multiply, but make sure that you maintain who you are, because otherwise you will evaporate as you multiply, right? That's exactly, by the way, what's happened, isn't it? Right? We have assimilated. So we have become, we may be thinking that we're following God into exile, but as soon as we assimilate into the culture, we've lost the purposes for what we're there for, right? So we need to multiply without decreasing. That's why he's got both those words. God never wastes any time with words. Why say it twice if you can say it once, especially if you're God, right? So he obviously has a purpose in mind to tell you to multiply and not decrease, and that is to become like the locust. We're back to Egypt, but remember, you are not going to assimilate. Okay? The only way you can do this without assimilating, by the way, is to live the kind of life that other people want. Because nobody is going to worry about assimilation if you're just following what they're doing, right? Look, in the 2nd century, the Gentile intelligentsia of the Messianic movement came up with a brilliant strategy. What they said is this: you can be Roman and Christian at the same time. You can't be Roman and Jewish at the same time, but you can be Roman and Christian, right? Because if you're Jewish, circumcision, dietary laws, temple, Shabbat. Romans certainly don't do circumcision. They could care less about Shabbat. They didn't worry about what they ate, right? So you couldn't be Roman and Jewish, but you could be Christian and Jewish because Christianity assimilated to the Roman Empire. So you could still believe in the God of Israel as long as the commandments of the God of Israel didn't apply to you, right? So Christianity did this. It multiplied, but it decreased. And God says, no, I want you to multiply and not decrease. You see how important that is? Okay? In other words, ultimately this verse, multiplying and not decreasing, is a statement of hope. Because it tells you you're going to be here a long time, God is with you, and as long as you maintain his instructions, you will have an effect on the culture, but you won't lose your identity in the process. It's hope. You're going to come out of this still being who you are, right? That doesn't mean, by the way, that you go into a convent, or you create an abbey, or a separate community that walls off all the impurities in life, right? That would be a little difficult to do as a slave who needs resources, needs land, needs seeds, needs husbands and wives, et cetera, right? Yes.
Is that kind of like reverse assimilation? We want them to assimilate into what we're doing, not the other way around.
Yes, my dear, you're absolutely right, and that is the message of the Brit Hadassah. That's the message of the apostolic writings. It says Gentiles are coming into the synagogue. It doesn't say that the synagogue is evaporating into the church, right? It's exactly God's plan of evangelism. That is, you live the kind of life that other people want, they come to you, right? You don't go out and chase the life that they have, okay? So you're absolutely right. You have now pointed out that this little story from Jeremiah is not only a look at the past, it's also a look into the future. Because God is saying, I'm going to teach you, by the way, this is what I intended for you when you came to Mount Sinai. And I said, I'm going to have a nation of priests, a holy nation of priests, right? This is what I intended for you to do. And over the next 1,000 years, you didn't do it. So now we're going to go back to exile and we'll start again. And I want to show you what you're supposed to do, right? Okay? What, doesn't make any sense? Makes perfect sense. Yeah, and we're still doing it. We're still trying to get people to assimilate by us going out and being relevant, right? We do, look, I don't have to be, fortunately, I don't have to be politically correct. But I do have to be kind of gentle, okay? But I can tell you that I wrote a piece. You're going to see, if you read today's word, which is my daily thing that comes out every day except Shabbat, there's a piece coming up called Mostly Blues. It's about Clapton and B.B. King and all this great music, right? So it's about heartache. It's about what happens with heartache. And what I say at the end of that is the church is supposed to be a place that joins people together because of tears, right? You go there because other people know the heartache that you've had. And you have empathy with them because they also have broken hearts, okay? That's very different than most of the churches that I've been in, which is rock, upbeat, joyful praise, God is great, everything is good music, which gives you a boost so that you can go back on Monday and feel heartbroken, right? In other words, what I'm saying is the church is the place where pain is the connector, because this is what God's asking you to do. He's saying, open your heart, experience the pain, because there are others just like you who are in exile, in Babylon, right? But that isn't what's happening. The church has now adopted the same methodology and the same organization, the same style as the culture. In fact, there's this great book by Peter Leithart called Against Christianity, and what he basically says is Christianity is institutionalized worldliness, right? Because what we've done is exactly what successfully worked for the Roman Empire. We've accommodated to everybody, right? That's not what God has in mind here. That's why the do not decrease is so important. It isn't repetition. It's the extension of the idea so that you will not fall prey to Babylon, which, by the way, a lot of Jews did. They never came back. Right? Why? Because they settled in. Because they became part of the Babylonian world. God's not telling you to become part of the Babylonian world. He's telling you that your job is to live in such a way so that other people who are the outsiders want to be in your world. Right? And by the way, you can't do that. There's a great book called If Not Now, When? It's by Joseph Telushkin, and it's about Hillel. Okay? And he says, I wrote this in the forward of the book, he says, he's a very famous rabbi in New York, and one of the other rabbis came to him, and they were discussing a problem that the guy was having in his synagogue, where a young Jewish lady in the synagogue had fallen in love with an outsider, a Gentile, and they wanted to get married. And the Gentile guy came to him and said, look, I'll convert to Judaism. I'll go through the whole process, the whole thing, right? I want to be married to this woman. And the rabbi refused. And he refused because he said, we can't allow impure ideas to come into our congregation. Even though the guy was willing to go through it all, he says, no, you're not part of our Jewish heritage, therefore I can't marry you. And Telushkin wrote the book because he said, if we continue with that attitude, we'll go extinct. The Jewish population is declining every year. Why? Because it's got the defensive mechanism now. I can't let anybody in, right? Because of what will happen to the purity of our culture. But in fact, that's exactly what God's saying you can't do. You got to be involved in all the world around you so that those people want to be like you. Okay? Multiply but do not decrease. Okay, next verse. Last verse. Wow, it's going quick. Also seek the shalom of the city. NASB translates this, prosper them. Okay? What is to seek the shalom of the city? Well, first you have to know that there are two words in Hebrew for seek, and they're important to know the difference between the two. Okay? One of them is darash. The other is bakash. Darash is the word that's used for intellectual acquisition, to seek out facts and knowledge and understanding. Okay? Bikash is the word for seeking for moral content, right? Okay? Which word does he use here? Take a guess. Nope. He uses darash. Why? Because if I seek moral content, I will get involved with the values and morality of the culture. But if I seek intellectual understanding of the culture, I'll know how they think, how they work, what their worldview is, right? Now I can converse, I can have intellectual conversations, I can have articulate expressions of who I am and who you are without following the morality of the culture that I'm in, right? So darash, not bikash. So when it says seek the shalom, he's not saying, by the way, go do what they do. When you're in Rome, do what the Romans do. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is you need to understand them, right? Now, how are you going to understand the Babylonians where you live if you never talk to them. If you put up the walls and say, we can't have anything to do with those people. I mean, I remember I was teaching in a Sunday school class a long way from here, 3,000 miles from here, and the leader of the Sunday school class, in a Baptist church, was complaining that across the street there was a strip club. And he said, we won't have anything to do with the girls in that club. They're sinners. And I thought to myself, that's exactly the wrong attitude. Because what you have is life, and you're not willing to talk to them about it? So I'm in Singapore. Now I go to Singapore quite often, and there's a church there called GBG. God bless Geylang. Geylang in Singapore is the heart of the red light district. The church is there on purpose because their mission is to walk the streets, to get involved with the prostitutes who are mostly there because of sex slavery, right? And to try to rescue them out. A completely different attitude of that church compared to the guy who said we won't have anything to do with them, right? This church in Singapore, their whole life is built around helping these women see life, okay? One of the things that I've done since I got aware of this is one of these women, whose name is Shinta, comes from Jakarta. She was kidnapped into sex slavery. She has a little boy in Jakarta. And they basically said, if you don't do this, we're going to hurt your little boy. They sent her off to Singapore. She was forced into prostitution. This church rescued her out of that. And she's now gone back to Jakarta and created a ministry called Children Under the Bridge. If you want to read about Children Under the Bridge, you go to my homepage, skipmoen.com. Down in the right-hand corner, it'll say Children Under the Bridge. We start with 35 kids. We're up to about 130 children now that are basically children that have been abandoned because their mothers are prostitutes, right? And these children live on the street. And Shinta went back there to create this ministry for them, and so we support her now. We're feeding 135 kids a day. We're giving them basic education. We're getting medicine for lice in their hair. There's a bunch of photographs on there. You wouldn't believe the conditions that they live in, and you can do something about it. You can do something about what happens in Babylon, because that's Babylon like you don't know it. Okay? That's right. And the whole point is, my effort is not to get you involved in a massive organization. Okay. Oh, am I supposed to quit? Oh. Oh, yeah, okay. Okay. So the whole point of my organization in helping her is not to become a massive, multinational charity, but it's to say that here are the faces of the children that we're doing something with. You have a direct contact with them. Whatever you do goes right into Shinta's pocket to help her stay alive and keep this thing going. There's zero overhead, right? So it's cool. I mean, if you want to come and see, come with me. I'm going in September. There's a guy in Ohio who's coming with me who's trying to do a big fundraiser for her. Tim Spalletti's coming to Jakarta, and we're going to spend time with these kids. So you want to come? Come. Okay, so anyway, seek, right? In other words, understand them. That's one of the things that I try to do, is to help you understand yourself, right? Because, by the way, if you live in Babylon and you don't understand how Babylon thinks, you are not separate from Babylon. You're involved in Babylon, you didn't even know it, right? The last time I was here, we talked about the difference between Greek and Hebrew worldviews. Education, politics, social structure, economics, right down the list, you are all involved in Babylon, right? Most of the time, you don't even know you're involved in Babylon. This is Babylon, right? Did you know that the British rail system invented the 24-hour day? It doesn't exist in the ancient world. There hasn't always been a 24-hour day. In fact, there's never a 24-hour day when you really think about it. The British rail system invented the 24-hour day because they needed trains in London to be on the same time as they were in Oxford. So they created time zones where the time actually doesn't change as you go east and west, right? Oxford and London are in the same time zone. So noon in London is the same as noon in Oxford, okay? Except if you go to Sydney. In Sydney, it's 12 noon. In Adelaide, it's 11:30. Because it's a 30-minute time zone. Tell me how that happens, okay? In other words, Our concept of time is artificial. It's completely created by men. It has nothing to do with the way the world really works. How many of you carry a watch, look at the time, set your appointments, etc., according to this, right? This is Western. This has nothing to do with the time of the Bible. How do I set time in the Bible? How do I know when it is in the Bible? Sunrise, which, by the way, differs every single day of the year. Okay, what about seasons? What do I know about the seasons? When the barley comes out of the ground. When is that? Well, April 22nd at 4:15 in the afternoon. No, I don't think so. Right? Do you see that even your concept of a simple thing like time has completely immersed you in the Babylonian world and you didn't even know it? Right? Okay? But if you don't seek that, you won't be able to talk to people about what's happening in Scripture, because Scripture doesn't work like that. 3 days and 3 nights in the tomb isn't three 24-hour consecutive days and nights. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way, because Hebrew doesn't think in terms of 24-hour days. And by the way, if it doesn't think in 24-hour days, then what in the world is day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6 in Genesis? 24 hours? No, that was the British Rail System version of the Genesis account. Okay? Sunrise, sunset? Yeah, but is that a 24-hour day? No. And by the way, since we have the Genesis account where the sun and the moon come in the 4th day, I guess maybe day, yom, has a lot bigger application than I would have imagined, okay? I mean, there's all kinds of stuff going on there that's related to Egyptian mythology, right? Should be related to Egyptian mythology because the people just came out of Egypt. The whole point is we read our own Bibles with this Western Babylonian view, and we think that's what God is saying, okay? So what I'm trying to do is to impress upon you how important it is to seek understanding of the culture that you're in so that you can recognize the difference, right? These people knew the difference, and their job was to recognize how Babylonians think so that I can have something to sit down and talk to them about that's important, right? Our job is to recognize that we're Babylonians, and we need to rethink how the world works, okay? So seek their peace. Right? Shalom. What does shalom mean? No war? In Greek thought, the absence of war is peace. That's what eirene means in Greek, the absence of war. Is that what shalom means? What does shalom mean? Well-being. Okay, now wait a minute. I'm the slave, I'm the oppressed people, I'm the one in exile, I'm the one God's given me all these instructions for self-sufficiency, and I'm supposed to seek the well-being of my captor. Okay? I'm supposed to do everything that I can to make his life prosperous, wonderful, blessed, benevolent, etc. Okay? That should remind you of another story. Yeah, that certainly reminds me of that one. That happens to come about 600 years later. But let's start another story from the Torah that is about a slave who sought the well-being of his master. Joseph. So here I am, and by the way, that should tell me something about the character that I need to be if I'm going to be in Babylon. Joseph complained about his captivity every day of his life. Joseph worked as hard as he could to undermine Potiphar. Joseph didn't care about what was happening to the people in Egypt. On and on, wrong. Joseph is completely involved in the Egyptian culture. He serves out his unjust. Israel doesn't even have unjust slavery. They deserved it. Joseph didn't deserve it, right? But he serves it out without complaint. You don't see him ever praying to God, get me out of here. Please, Jesus, come back now so I can leave this prison. You don't ever see him say that, right? What does he say? Well, as long as I'm here, I might as well talk to the wine taster and the baker, right? Okay? I mean, the whole point is Joseph is sad. Look, how does he name his children? God's blessed me in the land of my enemies. God's made me forget my family, right? I mean, think about it. Joseph is so Egyptian that his own family doesn't recognize him, right? Is that you? You maintain your relationship with God, but you look so much like a Babylonian that they wouldn't recognize the difference, right? Is that you? You don't assimilate, but you're completely involved in the world that's around you, so that people will come to you and trust you with advice. and they want your counsel. And by the way, they have a really nice daughter and you have a great son, right? Don't you see how this thing works? What God's trying to do, he doesn't tell you to assimilate. He's telling you to get so involved that you're part of the world that you're in, right? No more of this, I have to isolate myself and run off to the assembly because I can't deal with the outside world. That's not what God has in mind at all. In fact, if you think about Joseph, Joseph becomes the character of the person that God is asking for in Babylon, you'll recognize that what Joseph did was save Egypt, right? And he becomes the model of the Messiah. Wow. Okay? Seek in order to prosper the very people who have oppressed you. Okay? Well, notice the next part of the verse. For where I took you as captives, where I sent you. In other words, what God is saying, this is no accident. You didn't end up here just because your great-grandfather immigrated from Norway. It had nothing to do with it. This is engineered, right? Okay? It's part of the divine plan. He's reminding these people that he's still in control. I've just sent you into a place that you need to get active and do what you're supposed to do. In other words, there's another story here. There's always another story, right? Which part of the Torah does this remind you of? God brings his people together and he says, by the way, I want you to live like this and this and this. I'm sending you to a place. Where does that happen? But it's Abraham and it's also Exodus. It's at Sinai where he says, okay, here's the task. I want you to do this and this. And I'm sending you into the promised land because you're going to live in such a way that the other nations will come and say, who is this God that you're serving? Right? Okay? By the way, you didn't get it the first time, so we're going to start again. We're going to start in Babylon, right? Why do I need to know that God intended this? You're a prisoner of war. You get hauled off to Babylon. You start doing all this stuff. Why do I need to know that this is what God intended? It does give you the contentment to do what he wants to do, but there's something else. Why do I need to know that he wanted this? You're part of the divine plan, and let's not forget the important word here, hope. Because if it's God who's behind it, you know that eventually God will, just like the Exodus, bring you out, right? The Exodus story isn't about going in and staying there. The Exodus story is about going in and coming out, right? So as soon as I realize that these verses, these three verses are about the garden, Adam, Joseph, Ruth, Boaz, down the list, the Exodus, Moses, Abraham. As soon as I realize that, what do I realize? God's behind all this. It's just a matter of waiting. Okay? By the way, it's not a matter of me waiting for the Babylonians to die off. It's a matter of me, and it's not a matter of me waiting for the end of my lifetime to see it change, because he's already said it's going to take generations, right? I might not even be here when it all changes, but it doesn't make any difference because God is engineering the whole thing so that it will come about the way that he wants it to, right? It's hope, okay? Now, last part. And pray to Adonai for it. Actually, it should say, and pray to Adonai for them, the Babylonians. But this is really interesting because prayer is the last thing on the list. Now, I don't know about you, but if you came out of the evangelical world like me, most people would say the first thing you need to do is to pray for these people. That's the last thing God asks you to do. Why? Why does he have it last on the list? You thought it was just a jumbled order of stuff? No way. Don't look how we started. We started with Genesis, then we moved on to Joseph, then we moved on to the Exodus, then we moved on to Ruth, then we moved to Judges. We've got the whole list there, right? Judges, then Ruth, and on, okay? So why does he have prayer last? Why does God say do all those other things and then pray for them? It does help you when you pray for others, but here's the point. If I'm doing all those other things first, it changes my attitude about prayer. In other words, I'm not praying anymore, God, get me out of here. God, get even with these captors. God, take care of them so I can get back to Jerusalem. Now I'm fully involved in the culture. What am I praying for? I'm praying for them because I'm part of their struggles and their misunderstandings and their heartaches. I now am involved in their families. I'm involved in their business. I live in their neighborhoods. I start praying for their well-being. I won't do that if I show up as a slave in a refugee camp and the guy's standing outside the fence with a gun. I'm not praying, Lord, make his life wonderful. Just give him such a blessed home life and let his children grow up to be fantastic doctors and lawyers. I'm not praying about that. What am I praying for? Get me out of here. So God says, okay, I'm going to start you off with how we're going to erase the get me out of here attitude, and we're going to step through this thing one time, one action at a time, action, 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 and when you get to the end, now you can pray for them. Right? The idea is to intercede, to assess, and to intervene on behalf of these other people. Right? Pray to the Lord, pray to Adonai on its behalf. In other words, you haven't decided to pray to the Babylonian gods because you didn't assimilate. You didn't decrease, you multiplied. Okay? So you still are serving Yod-Heh-Vah-Heh, right? But now he has you serving him for the benevolence of your oppressor. You're doing exactly what Yeshua said. Love your enemy. Okay, so if I said, how are you going to love your enemy? Tell me the steps that you go through to love your enemy. You should have turned me to Jeremiah 29 and said, well, I'm going to build a house. I'm going to create a business that hires people. I'm going to have fruit trees. I'm going to get my children involved. You can go right through the list because that's loving your enemy, isn't it? That's exactly what God says. Here's how you love your enemy. Bing, 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 bing. And when you get to the end, then you can pray for him. So in about 45 years or 50 years or so, you can get down on your knees and pray, Lord, bless these people. But you got a 40 or 50 year window to get this other stuff done. Okay? So, the long haul. Here's the interesting thing about God's commands. None of these would have been expected. There's not a single thing on this list that if you were a captive slave from an oppressing army, you would immediately think, this is what I have to do. There's nothing on this list that you would think of. And by the way, the Babylonians know that. All oppressing armies know that the people that they conquer are going to rebel and are going to be cantankerous and have a terrible attitude and on and on and on, and they're going to have to force them, okay? And all of a sudden, they get a whole group of people who work on their behalf and who volunteer to do other things and to actually take care of them and watch over them. They get a whole nation of Josephs, and it changes everything about the relationship, doesn't it? Right? In other words, God asks you to do everything that's exactly the opposite of your human inclination. Okay? So here you are. You're living in Babylon. And you can go home tonight, look in the mirror and say, am I doing everything that's exactly the opposite of my human inclination? I live in this place, and am I doing the backwards things? Right? The things that nobody would expect me to do. Because guess what? I serve a sovereign God who watches over me and grants me hope in spite of all this stuff and has given me story after story after story to know what I'm supposed to do. And I'm the one who's supposed to act like Joseph. Okay? So,
didn't the Babylonians eventually did ask them, tell us about your God?
yeah, and in fact, Daniel has a huge impact on Babylonian aristocracy and royalty as a result of being Daniel, right? All right. So a few reminders. First, none of this is the Christian convent community. This is not isolationism. This is exactly the opposite. Get out and get involved. Okay? Second, it has nothing to do with unequally yoked. Put that one aside. That's about business, not about families. It has absolutely nothing to do from fleeing from the world. You can't flee from the world and be involved in the way God wants you to be involved. You can't live it out and try to run away from it. Okay? It is not about putting up walls. Right? The last thing that you ever want is an assembly that's closed. Right? This has to be open so that we can fill the whole place with Babylonians, like us. Okay? And it is not about moral superiority. Right? I'm better than that person across the street because I believe in God. That will get you nowhere. This is where you sit down with the girl from the strip club and ask her about her life. Right? Okay? Why was Israel sent into captivity in the first place? Because they weren't doing this exact thing. They weren't doing that, right? Were they supposed to spread themselves out and assimilate into all the cultures? No. They were supposed to bring God's revelation into physical action on the earth so that the other cultures around them would see what was happening and come to them. Which means that, here's how you do the test of your life. How many people are coming to you and saying, boy, I want to know how you live like that, and tell me what makes you be the kind of person that you are, because I would never do those things that you do, right? Okay? What was missing from Israel's testimony? A complete commitment to being a priest, an intercessor to the nations. And so God had to start them over again. Okay? And let me give you some settling in stuff. Matthew 5:38-48. Do not I'm just going to give you the list. You'll fill in the words. Do not resist. Remember what he says? Do not resist. That's an opposite of common sense. Give more than required. Right? Comply with generosity. I mean, Yeshua's just giving them Jeremiah again, right? Okay? Give and lend. Right? And then, by the way, we notice that Leviticus 19:18 is connected to Matthew 5:43. Right? What does it say? It says you're not to hold your enemy with a grudge or vengeance or reprisal. You are to love your enemy. And the way that you do that is to be totally involved with them and understand how they think so that you can introduce them to the God who saves. Right? It's the only way to do it. No master is ever going to listen to a slave who's cantankerous. The master listens to the slave who works entirely for the benefit of the master. Right? The master listens to the one who he thinks has his best interest in mind. So you know somebody that you really want to understand, and love God and share in this fellowship. The only way that's going to happen is that you first must understand them, and they must believe that you are there for them. It is not going to happen if you hold up a sign, repent of the world, or go to hell. That's not going to work. Okay? What's going to work is that you have to make these people friends. Right? And by the way, that's exactly what Yeshua says. At the end of his ministry, when he's ready to leave, he says, now I'm going to send you into these places. What was the first place? I want you to go to Judea is the first one, right? In other words, your neighbor next door. Then where? Samaria. Oh, who lives in Samaria? All the people that you don't like. Okay? In other words, you're supposed to make disciples of the people next door. And, by the way, the Samaritans, the ones that don't like, you don't like, and they don't like you. Okay? And then to all the earth. Right? Okay? So if you're going to fulfill this thing, you better start with the Babylonian who lives next door. And you can't do that without understanding how they think and what they think about and what's important and valuable to them. And then you go to the next level of those enemies who don't really like you, and you do exactly the same thing again. And then you'll be fulfilling not only the Messianic commission, but the very thing God intended for his people to do from Exodus, from Mount Sinai on. Okay? All buried in 3 little verses. And there's more, but we won't scratch into that. Okay? Now you only have to read all the Torah stories again because of what Jeremiah said and realize how much of this is also a part of what Yeshua says. Right? It's all connected. Okay? And then you will no longer be Babylonians. You'll be exiled in Babylon. And you'll really know that you are and what to do about it. Okay? Great. Questions? Hey, get busy. Okay, thanks. So tomorrow we're going to talk about Ezer Kenegdo, the first 3 chapters of the Genesis story, and there's a whole ton of stuff in there that I think you're going to find quite surprising and very, very insightful. And there are books back there, Guardian Angel, the one that Roseanne named. There's a bunch of other books of stuff that I've written on various topics, and I hope that you'll